Finally, in May 1945, the war in Europe ended when the Germans surrendered to the Allies, and the guns were silent. After the war, the Allies conducted the famous Nuremberg trials, and the world became aware of the atrocities of the Nazi doctors and nurses.
We don't know the figures of the nurses who were involved because they were the workforce in these hospitals.
Although nurses were not named as defendants in the medical trials at Nuremberg, the results of some of their actions during the war were brought to light. For example, the horrific experiments done on young Polish women at Ravensbrück and the killing of the disabled persons in the so-called euthanasia programs were made public. Nurses, however, were not exonerated for their crimes. Many stood trial later on, and several were hanged for their actions. Author Vivian Spitz was an eyewitness court reporter for the Nuremberg war crimes trials of Nazi doctors. She refers to her book, Doctors from Hell, as she recalls the trial testimony she reported.
The victims were German, Czech, and Polish gypsies who were deprived of food and given only brackish yellow seawater for days, resulting in, of course, excruciating pain and foaming at the mouth, and in most cases, madness.
Many of these patients died.
They did experimentations where they would keep people in freezing temperatures until they were almost dead, revive them, and then expose them again.
Lower the temperature, raise the temperature until they froze and died. And then they took them directly to the autopsy table in what they called terminal experiments. And so they did low pressure studies where they took concentration camp prisoners and put them into specially designed rooms where they sucked out the oxygen, let in the oxygen until their lungs exploded and they died in terminal experiments. There were studies of bone and muscle and infectious diseases. They were trying out new antibiotics. So they took concentration camp prisoners and cut open and filleted and infected their legs and wounds to create simulated wounds.
We know that the sterilization program, the mercy killing program, and the unlawful, atrocious human experimentation program were masterminded, planned, suggested, implemented by physicians.
The majority of nurses were not members of the Nazi Party. However, to have a job in Germany, a nurse had to belong to one of several nursing organizations. There were 5 organizations for nurses. Among these, the National Socialist Nurses and the Red Cross nurses swore an oath of allegiance to Hitler. Additionally, the Protestant Nurses Organization said that it greets National Socialism with an open heart.
Surprisingly, more physicians, percentage-wise, joined the Nazi Party than the population in general. And I think physicians were very taken with the fact that we can use our science to improve the human race.
Many physicians and nurses enthusiastically supported the Nazi regime and were involved in all aspects of the Holocaust.
About 40% of German physicians were in the Nazi Party, while the lawyers and teachers and the other white-collar professions joined in much lesser numbers. If you didn't join the Nazi Party, there was no retribution.
Using inflammatory propaganda, Hitler and the Nazis began a campaign against the Jews.
The slogan says, to tell the truth and to act as if that truth is real.
Carbon taxes and other austerity measures have been proposed and are being implemented that will or already do affect the lives and well-being of ordinary individuals already struggling economically, many of them anyway, and we are to understand that it is on the basis of what they are projecting as a myth and a magical performance that it is as much rooted in magico-religious belief as it is in science.
Religion, really properly understood, is not about belief, but about behavior.
Is anyone else taking notice of this?
The group's beliefs are touted as scientifically true and/or spiritually correct. This leads to the strange situation where believers will put aside their own values in favor of the group's dogma, which is the test of a true believer. Psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton called this ideology over experience, or doctrine over person. A famous heart surgeon in the notorious Japanese group Om Shinrikyo murdered patients at the behest of his leader, in spite of the Hippocratic Oath's provision to do no harm.
They're being discriminated against. Jewish children can no longer go to their regular school. People cannot keep their jobs at the university or other professions. Hitler said, "Follow me, never mind God, never mind religion, just follow me, do what I am asking you to do."
And since the regime was totalitarian, and they were very good at public campaigns and propaganda, and they had enough scientists and physicians that were already marching to their drum.
Propaganda is an extremely powerful way to convince people to their way of thinking.
Germany's medical establishment began to support the Nazi Party, except for Jewish doctors, who were ostracized.
The official journal of the German Medical Association started to have a swastika on their journal, and they got rid of all the Jewish physicians, authors, people in office of all the different associations of societies very quickly.
Are people okay with self-righteous believers in climate disaster endorsing and pushing and promoting and shoving down people's throats these policies?
For a lot of us, protesting, marching, that's not something that we normally do, but you know what, these are times that call for us to do those things that we believe in and to march, and not just to march, because that's important to show solidarity, but then to do those things such as voter registration, get people out to vote, so that we can have people here who truly are committed to human rights, environmental rights, climate change, believe in climate change as though it's a religion, it's not a science.
Believe in climate change as though it's a religion, it's not a science.
They say the only thing that'll save us is the vaccine. The government, media, and celebrities are using fear to force you into something that you may not be sure about. They expect you to roll up your sleeve and do something to your body that can't be undone. I don't know about you, but we have a few questions.
Which are being quietly and silently implemented on the global level through the United Nations and various associated organizations through global accords. That's happening just steadily, progressively, step by step, a little more each time. They're getting nations roped into it, but publicly they admit they're pushing a cultural myth. Of course, they claim there's facts underlying that, but they're appealing to the public on the basis of a myth, a story, okay?
There can be restrictions on diet, usually the cheapest food possible, so often a high sugar, high carbohydrate diet, which can add to the lightheadedness of sleep deprivation. Group activities including dancing, singing, or reciting dogma all add to a natural sense of cohesion. Everything that is different to the surrounding society, language, dress, diet, dogma can add to the sense of exclusiveness and amplify alienation from that society. Add to this the promise that the secrets of the universe, eternal life or liberation from tyranny, are just a few steps away, and you have a potent mix.
It's a well-documented type of logical fallacy, and it should not be the basis on which society is transformed. Radically transformed, I might add.
You just have this situation where the UN is pushing this idea, which, shows that this climate change thing is as much about a religion, a new materialist religion of globalism than it is about anything else.
The death and rebirth of society is being mirrored in the transformation that takes place in every individual who joins a movement like Extinction Rebellion.
The world scientists have consensus. We need to see a rapid decline in global fossil fuel use if we are to have a hope of an inhabitable planet.
After years of strong Nazi propaganda, Germany's doctors and nurses began to accept the belief that racial hygiene would be good for the nation.
Social Darwinism said we need to eliminate these inferior people that were handicapped, that were maybe mentally disturbed. We want a healthy, thriving society.
In Germany, the proponents of the eugenic movement were the most prominent, the most powerful, the establishment. The legal system became Nazified immediately.
Well, of course, it required lawyers, it required doctors, it required bureaucrats, it required administrators, but many of the nurses were the ones who actually carried out the injections. But for a long time, nurses were the agents of the physicians, and the physicians in the Nazi period were agents of the state. So that's very important, because physicians were no longer asked to care for patients, but to care for the state, the folk, the German folk. And so what was good for the state was what was important, not what was good for an individual patient.
Obedience was still very much a part of the way nurses were taught and the way we thought. So it's not surprising that the nurses in the Nazi era got caught up in all this.
Euthanasia programs were established in Nazi Germany in which children and adults were killed if they were considered unfit for life and were a burden on the state. The true meaning of euthanasia would be the mercy killing of a person with their permission or their request. However, this was not the case in Nazi Germany. These killings were without consent. They were murders. In the 1920s, German lawyer Karl Binding and German psychiatrist Alfred Hoche co-authored the book The Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Life. This book greatly influenced Hitler's thinking about euthanasia.
Everybody had that propaganda thrown at them. It was common. It was everywhere, and it espoused the idea that people who were in some way deficient should be killed, so that they didn't carry on the defective genes, and so that they weren't a burden on the state.
Timothy Stacy discusses this rebirth in terms of a three-stage process as outlined by French anthropologist Arnold van Gennep in what he calls his theory of ritual. It says, quote, "The first stage is one of separation from a previous status, society, or way of living. The second one is ambiguity or liminality, in which one leaves one's old life behind but is not yet incorporated into a new one. And the third stage is integration into that new identity."
The nurses, just as everybody else in society, were susceptible to this. The nurses were working in hospitals where children with disabilities, people with mental illnesses, a whole range of conditions were cared for. They weren't coerced into becoming part of these programs.
Once you accept humans can be humanized, eventually you can engage in exterminating it. And this was a gradual and very powerful and unfortunately very effective process that took place in Germany.
The Nazi euthanasia program first started in 1939 as a means to eliminate handicapped children.
You have families who, because of all the propaganda, are believing that to have a child with negative traits is a bad thing. It's bad for the health of Germany.
They were killing children with disabilities, children with Down syndrome, children with cardiac anomalies, children with cerebral palsy, children who didn't develop normally, who were considered to be useless feeders. That was the term used.
Public health nurses would go to the families, promise them, if you will give your child to us, your child will get the best care. And so people were falsely led to believe that and relinquish their children. The nurses were involved in the killing of children by giving them overdoses, by taking them outside knowing that it was going to contribute to their death.
I got very interested in this when I found out that nurses actively killed their patients, and I became intrigued into how they could come to believe that killing was a legitimate part of their caring role, which they did. The propaganda around the whole idea of killing people for the good of the state was profound, even down to children doing exercises in their school books on how much it costs to keep people with a disability, for example.
Midwives and physicians were mandated by German law to report any infant born with a birth defect, and the infant would be placed in an institution. Midwives were paid for each birth that they reported.
Midwives were licensed. They had to go through a similar training period as nursing, and many of them were independent practitioners. So not long after the child was put into a home, he or she would then be moved to another institution further away. Of course, there was no consent, no nothing. These killings were done without the parents' approval, more or less, in the main.
The nurses and the midwives who were involved in the carrying out, maybe not even the ideology, but were actually the doers of the euthanasia program. Euthanasia is really a euphemism for murder because these were not terminally ill patients. These were children that were taken and murdered, mostly children who had handicap or mental retardation.
A fanatic will believe that the murder of innocents is vital to bring about the caliphate, or the end days. Perhaps putting aside years of benevolent behavior to follow this ruthless path. If the leader says that salt is sweet, the follower may well taste that sweetness, just as those hypnotized will cheerfully eat an onion as if it were an apple.
Rituals are key in moving people from one stage to the next. We've seen that everywhere from cults to secret societies to some religions. That's the process. It's always the same. It's always a death of the person's identity, of their ego, of what they knew, whatever, fill in the blank. And then they go through a process where they are reborn into this new identity.
Does it really look authentic to you?
Just here facilitating peaceful protests at the moment. We're literally going around and talking to them. As you'll see, there's lots of officers around, we're chatting to the protesters. So far they've had music and then they've gone and had their sort of festival in the road.
By now people have become pretty familiar with the movement's logo, a symbol that looks like an hourglass inside of a circle. Reportedly, this is meant to stand for their message that time is running out for the planet. The group drew outrage a few weeks ago when they defaced the Wiltshire chalk horse with their logo, just a few months after local school children had finished painstakingly rechalking it. For its part, a group spokesperson replied that he would make no apologies for upsetting people, and that the logo was placed on the horse to highlight, quote, that we are destroying the planet we live on. What XR actually ended up destroying in the process was the children's joy at having restored their monument and their faith in adults to respect them in general. As the story goes, this logo was designed all the way back in 2011 by an anonymous London street artist known only as ESP, who admits that the symbol came from research into the history of symbols, including runes and medieval alchemy symbols, among others. This particular symbol is a Degas rune turned on its side.
There are 5 symbols that are most closely associated with the National Socialists, but you may be surprised that they were not created by them. They are the swastika, the eagle, the right arm salute, the death's head, and the SS runes. All are politically sensitive today and are banned in some countries. But what are the stories behind them? Where did they originate? And how did they end up appropriated by the Nazis? Let's begin with the most contentious, the swastika. Originating in India, this remarkable symbol meant good luck until used by the Nazis. Swastika is derived from the Sanskrit word svastika, which means conducive to well-being. Many different forms of the swastika are to be found in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, all positive and spiritual symbols. In Europe, the swastika has many names. In Germany, it is called the Hakenkreuz, or hooked cross. It has represented gods such as Zeus in ancient Greece, Jupiter in the Roman Empire, and Thor in ancient Germanic religion. In North America, the swastika was commonly used for the same reason, as a positive symbol of good luck. Many Native American tribes used it, primarily the Navajo, Sioux, Hopi, and Passamaquoddy peoples. Before World War II, it was even the symbol of the United States 45th Infantry Division, worn as a shoulder patch. I grew up in the English county of Essex, and the City Hall in Chelmsford is covered in swastikas to this day, and none of it has anything to do with National Socialism. The adoption of this symbol by the Nazis was a masterful piece of marketing, perhaps the most successful logo in history. After all, no matter where you are in the world, if you see a swastika, regardless of its use, you can't help but think of Nazis, even 80 years later. So of course Hitler didn't invent the swastika, rather he adapted a symbol already common in Europe for many centuries for his own purposes. Hitler created the Nazi Party image in 1925 after much trial and error, taking a black swastika facing right, turned 45 degrees, inside a white circle against a red background. The colours deliberately echo the old German imperial flag, while the cross represented a race emblem for the German people, an Aryan symbol. In this again, Hitler was not original, for the swastika had first been used in Germany with this symbolism in 1907 on the flag of the Order of the New Templars, an Austrian nationalist secret society. It is tragic that a religious symbol, thousands of years old, that symbolizes so many positive things, has been permanently defamed because of just 20 years' use by the Nazis. There are calls today to rehabilitate the swastika, but Nazi imagery endures very strongly, and it is unlikely that this will happen anytime soon. The history of the potent SS symbol, the Totenkopf, or death's head, is far older than the Nazi period, and was and still is used in some countries as an army symbol that has no connection to National Socialism. It's yet another symbol that the Nazis adopted from history for their own purposes. King Frederick the Great of Prussia first used the Totenkopf as a military emblem when he formed a regiment of hussars. The unit also wore black uniforms. In 1809, another German state, Braunschweig, or Brunswick, also formed a black uniformed hussar regiment that wore the Totenkopf. The skull badge was worn as a sign of revenge against the French. This unit fought alongside the Duke of Wellington, the Battle of Waterloo, in 1815. With the creation of the German Empire, the Totenkopf continued in military service, most famously the Prussian Death's Head Hussars, an elite cavalry force. Several members of the German imperial family were members of this regiment. During World War I, the Totenkopf was again worn as a regimental badge in action. In 1919, the emblem was used by the Freikorps, right-wing German paramilitaries that fought against communism in post-war Germany. It was next used during the Weimar Republic by the 5th Cavalry Regiment, continuing the traditions of the old imperial cavalry. It first appeared in the early Nazi period as the insignia of the Stabswache, Hitler's early bodyguard unit. The unit was eventually renamed the Schutzstaffel, or SS, and continued to use the German imperial symbol on its caps. But during World War II, the Totenkopf was not only limited to the SS. The regular army's long cavalry tradition saw it also used as an army panzer uniform badge. Outside of Germany, the death's head is still used today. The British Army's Royal Lancers cap badge and motto form the saying "Death or Glory." The Royal Air Force's number 100 squadron uses a skull and crossbones symbol, while the United States Marine Corps reconnaissance battalions use it, as well as the South Korean 3rd Infantry Division. The SS, as the personification of Heinrich Himmler's pseudo-scientific Aryan supermen, employed ancient Germanic runes, attempting to draw a line back to some pagan, northern European Germanic myths and legends. The most famous runic symbol they used was that of the SS itself, the Doppelte Siegrune. Originally, the lightning-shaped rune represented the sun, but an early precursor to the Nazi movement, the Völkisch movement of the 19th century, changed its meaning to represent Sieg, or victory, hence its name today, the Siegrune. Fast forward to 1933, and the SS required a symbol that was both memorable and symbolic. SS officer Walter Heck, who was a graphic designer in Bonn, decided on the Siegrune, but doubled and placed side by side like lightning bolts. In a clever play on words, the runes represent both the name SS and the rallying cry from the Völkisch movement, reinterpretation of the rune as victory, victory.
They were also used in the practice of runic magic. According to Dr. Thomas Carlson, in Old Norse and Germanic languages, the word rune signifies secret, mystery, or secret whisper, and that at first, runes were not used in normal writing, but were exclusively magical symbols used to express the hidden forces of the universe, which have exoteric and esoteric or occult meanings. So there's the superficial language aspect that everyone's familiar with when it comes to runes, and then there's this deeper hidden level of meaning that's tied to occult spirituality. Degas represents illumination and awakening, the rune of culmination. It represents a zenith, the highest point of a circle and beginning of a new cycle, a day rune that describes one who leaves the old behind and attains a new consciousness through rebirth. Dr. Carlson writes that Degas, quote, is similar to the butterfly and represents the step out of the chrysalis and into a new reality. And Degas is a rune that we've been increasingly seeing more and more in the past year. This exact rune should be familiar to any of you who watched our Midsommar breakdown. It's the exact same rune in the exact same position that the main character Dani wore on her shoes prior to the Maypole dance where she's crowned May Queen before she joins the film's nature-worshipping death cult and is illuminated. The movie has a heavy repeated message of humans needing to be one with and live in balance with nature, even though the cult featured in the film has to resort to literal human sacrifice in order to do so. This same rune, and actually the same theme of human sacrifice for nature, was also prominently featured in another 2019 film, Godzilla King of the Monsters, for anyone who bothered to wade through all of the apocalyptic climate change propaganda in order to watch another Godzilla movie. It was the logo for the secretive Titan studying group appropriately named Monarch, a member of which, paleobiologist Dr. Emma Russell, joins with eco-terrorists and awakens Monster Zero, an ancient alien which seeks to use Titans to terraform Earth, because she says she wants to, quote, heal the Earth from the damages humans have caused, by unleashing giant monsters to mass murder millions of people and destroy major cities across the world in order to rebuild them.
We never dared to confront the truth.
Which truth?
Humans have been the dominant species for thousands of years, and look what's happened. Overpopulation, pollution, war. The mass extinction we feared has already begun, and we are the cause.
Interesting to note is the fact that even though this movie was released in May 2019, a fake BBC News article shown in the end credits discusses the Amazon being on fire, and it's dated August 2019, somehow predicting the actual Amazon fires of August 2019 down to a matter of days. Just like it is used in these films, this symbol is an actual magical symbol being used to help realize the XR movement's stated goals.
Extinction Rebellion have chosen key thoroughfares in central London and given each of them a theme. But those sites also have the happy coincidence of describing the Extinction Rebellion logo. Nice touch.
In fact, in an Extinction Rebellion action policy document, XR writes that one of their aims is, quote, to build structure, community, and test prototypes in preparation for the coming structural collapse of the regimes of Western democracies, now seen as inevitable due to stored-up crisis, thus preparing a foundation to transform society. So while they want to do that to all of society, each individual who joins this movement is also going through that process.
I think one deciding point is in Germany, the notion that the health of the public is more important than the health of the individual. So consequently, to remove an unhealthy element was seen as good.
In September 1939, a decision was made to develop an adult euthanasia program for patients in psychiatric facilities. Hitler picked the date to coincide with Germany's invasion of Poland.
To expand it to include adults, the only way we're going to make this acceptable is to say we need these hospital beds for the war wounded. Why should the state pay to keep totally disabled people alive when our young guys are sent to the front, need to come back home and have care?
The name of this killing organization was T4. Eventually, 6 killing centers were established. Medical staffs were ordered to fill out questionnaires to evaluate whether their patients should live or die. Patients were placed in gas chambers that looked like showers. Then lethal carbon monoxide was pumped into the chambers, killing the patients.
You have to justify and rationalize what you're doing because you're doing it. But they actually believed it. And they actually believed that what they were doing was saving the folk from its contamination, from the infection, that there was a disease. And the disease was the handicapped and the infirmed, and that they needed to be cured through killing. And the disease was the handicapped and the infirmed, and that they needed to be cured through killing. Healing through killing.
They were told they were being transferred. The nurses packed their clothes, their lunch, rode with them on the buses. The hospitals, these 6, had specially constructed kind of breezeways that the buses would go through so the patients could be unloaded into the hospital without being viewed by the community.
However, it didn't take long for the communities near these hospitals to realize what was going on.
People would see the buses. The buses were very unique, painted gray, the windows were painted over and so forth. The buses would arrive, and within a very short period of time, this acrid smoke would be billowing out of the chimneys. Each hospital had a department to write condolence letters to the families. And there were mix-ups. They would write and say, we're sorry to tell you your uncle, Hans, died of appendicitis. And maybe he'd already had his appendix removed. People were becoming quite knowledgeable about what was going on. Even children would taunt other children, saying they're going to put you on the gray bus. You're going to go up the chimney.
Not only that, but these mummer-like play and dance performances that you see them doing in the streets, or the people dressed in ceremonial red gowns that's meant to symbolize the blood of the earth, or the people walking labyrinths just as the Aztecs once did. They're pulling from cultures the world over what are sometimes ancient magical rituals and performing them in service of this global transformation that they're attempting to bring about. Brendan O'Neill is an editor over at Spiked, and he was talking about the madness of Extinction Rebellion. He referred to it as an upper middle class death cult. Because that's the majority of who's there is the upper middle class. The average person who has to work a job, they don't have time to go do this. But back in October, when their big thing kicked off, a month ago, he wrote, "Yesterday in London, I witnessed an eerie, chilling sight. I saw a death cult holding a ceremony in public. The men and women gathered outside King's Cross Station and formed a circle. They swayed and chanted. They preached about end times. What will you do when the world gets hot, they intoned, conjuring up images of the hellfire they believe will shortly consume mankind. They sang hymns to their god, science. We've got all the science, all that we need to change the world. Hallelujah, they sang, rocking side to side as they did so. They demanded repentance. Buy less, fly less, fry less, said one placard. And like all death cultists, they handed out leaflets that contained within them the truth. The leaflets foretell floods and fire. We're in trouble. Sea levels are rising. Africa and the Amazon are on fire. And if you question their truth, well then, like those heretics who were hauled before the Inquisition 500 years ago, you will be denounced as a denier of their revelations, a denier of their visions. Denial is not a policy, their placards decreed. Spotting me filming their spooky apocalyptic ceremony, one of the attendees waved the placard in my face, a warning from the cult to a corrupted outsider. And he goes on to talk about how this is a millenarian movement that might speak of science, but is driven by sheer irrationalism and fear, moral exhaustion, and misanthropy. It's the deflated, self-loathing bourgeois coming together to project their own psychosocial hang-ups onto society at large. Yesterday's gathering, like so many other Extinction Rebellion gatherings, was middle-aged and middle-class. Working-class people in the poor of New Delhi, Mumbai, and Cape Town, some of the cities in which Extinction Rebellion will be causing their disruptions, cannot afford to take 2 weeks off work. But then again, these protests aren't for those people. In fact, they're against those people. And he goes on to explain how they want to bring in net zero carbon emissions by 2025 in just 6 years' time, which will halt a vast array of human activity that produces carbon. People who rely on those things for work and food and warmth, he says, screw them. They're only humans. Horrible, destructive, stupid humans. And it's interesting how the focus here is how it's us humans that have gotten us into this mess. They don't seem to be focusing on things like the fact that studies show the U.S. military is actually the biggest polluter on the planet, bar none, or the fact that mega corporations continue to poison us and the environment with cancer-causing plastic garbage when alternatives have been available since before the Industrial Revolution ever started. Are the corporations blamed for the giant plastic garbage island that's floating around in the Pacific Ocean, for example? No. The individual is blamed for buying stuff that mega corporations shouldn't even be producing in the first place because it's terrible for everyone and everything, period. I mean, this is a question I have. I understand individual responsibility, but when you drag everybody down to the point where large portions of the population are living in poverty, and then you sell them cheap plastic crap, and you mark up all of the earth-friendly products to a price that most people can't afford, what do you expect people to do? So I went on a whole thing about this the other day because it drives me crazy. Major corporations are producing a bunch of cheap plastic, chemical-laden crap and microfibers and just total BS. It's horrible for the environment. It's horrible for us to use and put in our bodies. It's just horrible. But then they sell this to everyone because they're totally allowed to do that, and that's fine, right? Then people buy it because that's what's for sale. And they assume that if it's for sale, it's probably okay. Because why would it be allowed to be for sale if it's not? You see? Then people buy it, right? And then everyone else from the media to the environmentalists, they all come along and they shame everyone and blame everyone and yell at the people who are buying the things and hardly, if ever, address the major corporations that are producing this toxic, poisonous crap in the first place. I mean, I just got done seeing this on Wired's Instagram. This is what I'm talking about. It's a whole post about how the plastic-infused fabrics that are used to make yoga pants are shedding all these synthetic fibers. And it says, you read that, your beloved yoga pants are terrible for you. Well, why are they making horrible microfiber yoga pants that are terrible for everyone and the environment? Why is that even a thing that's being produced? Here's another one in Discover magazine. The plastic tea bags release billions of microplastics into every cup. So you've probably seen these tea bags. Some of the higher end tea comes in these tea bags now, but these tea bags, they're not always made from something like hemp. They're sometimes made from nylon or polyethylene terephthalate. Terephthalate, I'm probably not even saying that right. Most often it's made out of plastic, these tea bags that they have here. And apparently when you pour hot water onto that, it breaks down and releases billions of plastic microparticles into the tea, and then people are drinking it. It also goes into everywhere. The bottled waters, the plastic bottled water, microplastic in there.
The widespread use of BPA, its impact on breast cancer, infertility, low sperm counts, genital deformities, and even diabetes and obesity, early menstruation, you name it. It's everywhere. If you get your blood tested, you're pretty much going to find it. It's in canned foods, plastics, food packaging, you name it. And the FDA won't ban it, even though Canada and European countries have.
That's going into everything. I mean, all this stuff is producing these nanoparticles, these nanoplastic particles, which are bad for everything. They're bad for humans, they're bad for animals, they're bad for the environment in general, the ocean, everything. It's just bad. Why are they putting tea in something that breaks down into nanoplastic particles that's bad for everything? Why is that a thing that can even be sold to people? So they're saying it's your fault because you bought it. How about don't make that stuff to begin with? Right?